Now, I told you about something about the most dangerous men in Acadia and about the return of a group that was led by the 5 escapees from South Carolina. That's a very particularly interesting set of circumstances and a very particular set of, let's say, trials and tribulations that were faced by a group of Acadian men in the years immediately following the great deportation in 1755. In this second session, I want to try to step back a little bit and give you more of an overview of all the trials and tribulations that faced the Acadians in the years starting with 1755. As everyone knows, in the in the spring of 1755, on June 16th to be exact, Fort Beauséjour was taken by the British, and that gave them free rein in the area of Nova Scotia and what's now southeastern New Brunswick to dispose of the Acadians as they willed. And on the 28th of July, the Council in Nova Scotia, under Charles Lawrence's direction as Lieutenant Governor, it was determined that they would deport the Acadian population to the extent that was possible. And they had decided that they would, in the same time, confiscate all the lands of the Acadians and, of course, their buildings, livestock, and essentially all their property, except the property that they could carry on their own backs. They were only allowed to take away what they could carry. And we know the story of the great confusion that ensued, that the plans for this carrying out this deed to deport 6,000 people from Nova Scotia and parts of New Brunswick, that this whole thing was cobbled together with ships brought for the purpose, and that some ships were proved unworthy. They had to be replaced by others. Estimates of the population didn't prove to be exact in some instances, and in certain cases they sent troops to bring back people, and they found that people weren't there waiting with open arms to welcome them by any means. So that there were certain things that didn't work too well, and of course in one part of this, as we've seen with the 21 men, it was a very determined effort to punish these particular men by separating them from their families and sending them on the frigate to South Carolina. But there were other separations that took place because, as I explained, the local parish priest had intervened and told the women not to turn themselves in with their children. There were also separations that inevitably occurred from the simple fact that not everybody lived with their mother and father. In one of my ancestral families, for example, my ancestor, another Joseph Leblanc, he was married a second time, and one of his boys from his first marriage was living with his mother's sister in a different parish, so they were separated and never saw one another again. So there was all kinds of confusion going on, and then inevitably people were separated from their immediate families, and obviously with the extent of the population that was subject to this, and with the interconnections of the families, everybody was related virtually to everybody else in some way or fashion or other, inevitably there were separations where the father of one family was the brother of the father of another family, and they were sent in different directions. The clans were broken up. And of course, all of this must have been an enormous strain on the people who were subject to it. They were sent to strange countries or strange provinces, the English colonies, where the language, the religion, and the entire way of life of the people who lived there were totally different from what they had, and the people were also their enemies. They're long-term enemies. The English and the French had conflicts for as long as anybody could remember. We know these are all the facts of the history. In one case, in the case of one ship, the Pembroke, This is another Paul Delaney story where Paul did the research on identifying the 232 people who were on this vessel. We collaborated to a certain extent. I contributed to this too, and we are very proud to be able to say that we're pretty sure that these indeed were the people on this ship. The Pembroke had a mutiny on board, and the Acadians overpowered the crew, and then instead of going to North Carolina, they turned around and went back to Nova Scotia, and then over into what's now New Brunswick. And when the British came to get the boat back, Charles de Champ de Boisbert, who was the remaining French military officer in the area, ordered that it be burned so that the blankety-blank British wouldn't get it back. Now, these people had escaped from deportation, but escaping from deportation didn't mean they escaped from the trials and tribulations of this period. Now, for many years I've heard people say, oh, okay, my ancestor wasn't deported. Well, that may be true, but it is not true that someone was not disturbed, except for Marie-Madeleine Maisonneuve, who had married an English, well, a Huguenot, who was a Protestant, William Winiot, and her daughters had married officers in the Port Royal garrison, and she was not disturbed. She remained in Acadia. She was Acadian, and she remained in Acadia. But everybody else was disturbed. Everybody else was chased off their property. They lost their property, and in some instances, and quite a few instances, those who remained behind and were not deported ended up worse off than those who were deported. We know all the stories from all the volumes 23 and 24 of the Massachusetts Archives that relate to the French neutrals in Massachusetts, and we have all these petitions and all these complaints that all these horrible things happened to these people. And yet we have families there, such as my ancestors and Emmy and Susan's ancestors, the Forêt, who were in Massachusetts, who went there with their children, and they had more children, and then they went back to Nova Scotia, and they didn't lose any children. Nobody died except old grandma, who was old, was very old, and I mean, she eventually was going to die anyway. So in Massachusetts, the people suffered less, I will submit to anyone, they suffered much less in this whole operation than many of the people who remained behind in the maritime provinces. And also, families like the ones on the Pembroke were headed for other sorts of disasters. The Acadians had been isolated in Acadia from all sorts of comings and goings from other Europeans for generations. And over the course of these generations, they gradually lost those accumulated immunities that were found in most European populations. It was commonplace in Europe in the 18th century to have outbreaks of smallpox. There were no inoculations yet for that, but people built up immunities by being exposed to the disease, and mothers who had had smallpox passed on to their children some of this immunity, so that when the children were eventually exposed to it, because these epidemics were periodic and returned, the children would have a certain amount of immunity. But by being isolated in Acadia, our Acadian ancestors lost those immunities over time. And when they arrived in places where there were diseases to which they had not been exposed, as soon as they were exposed to those diseases, they were condemned to death. And the first victims of all in the expulsions were the passengers on two vessels, the Edward and the Experiment. These vessels had come from Port Royal, and one was supposed to go to New York and one was supposed to go to Connecticut. But because of the bad weather that they encountered, they went off course. And when they went off course big time. They landed in the West Indies, and the people were on the island, or a lot of the people were on the island of Antigua. And there they were exposed to diseases, and unfortunately many lost their lives. 478 people had embarked on these two vessels, and when the vessels eventually reached their destinations in 1756, there were only 331 people left to disembark, which means that at the very least 147 had died, And I'd point out to you that at this particular point in time with a typical Acadian population, when we're talking about 500 people or thereabouts, we have in a group of 500 people approximately 125 who would have been female and 16 years of age or up. And if we discount that, let's say, and cut it back to some 60 or so, those would have been the married women who would have been in childbearing years, and the average family produced a child every 2 years. So out of those 60-odd women, about 15 of them would have given birth to a child in this period where these ships were off course and then finally to their destination. So we could reasonably say that over 160 Acadians had died because of the 15 increase that we normally should have had in that population of just that small group. That's another thing that comes into play with the estimates and the studies that are made of the Acadian population. The Acadian population was always a moving target. The Acadians were always in Acadia until the deportations. They were always increasing and multiplying. Now, the next group that we have to deal with in terms of the real hardships that befell these people are those who were sent to Virginia. In Virginia, the people were allowed to disembark from the vessels, but the local authorities weren't interested in keeping them for any length of time. And in May of 1756, they were retransported, put on a series of other vessels, and they were sent to England. And there they encountered an enemy who was worse than the British. It was called smallpox. 1,032 people arrived in June 1756, and within 90 days, 142 had died just at Bristol of smallpox. 66 others died at Falmouth by December of 1756. In all, about a third of all the Acadians who were sent to England in this re-deportation, or the second phase of the deportation of those sent to Virginia, had perished from smallpox. The result of this is that in 1763, when we would normally expect to find a lot more than 1,000 Acadians, we find a lot less. Some 750 or 800 people survived at that time. But as I said, those who remained in Acadia were even worse off. In many instances, were even worse off than these who were sent from one place to another and exposed to these diseases. Because what happened in Acadia is that people no longer had any resources to keep themselves alive. And in the winter of 1756, 1757, many Acadians found themselves on the Miramichi River around one of the last surviving French posts. And they had gathered there because they could no longer feed their families, because they no longer had their farms. They didn't have the root cellar. They didn't have the crops that would have been put up for the winter time. And as a result, they starved, literally. Lots of people starved. There were, I think, let me see now, the population figure we've got now. Ronnie Gilles Leblanc, who works in Parks Canada, used to work with us at the University of Moncton, has made a study of the population there, and I see I neglected to note the figure, but I think that he estimates that there were somewhere around 1,200 Acadians at the Camp d'Espérance, as they call it, the Camp of Hope, but it was really the Camp d'Espoir. It was the Camp of Despair, because, as I say, they were starving that winter. There are reports that I won't repeat because they're not fit to repeat, but we do know that at least 200, at least there's a letter from the Bishop of Quebec, according to Placide Gaudette, that mentions that 200 had died of starvation or malnutrition or the results of not being properly nourished or fed. And Ronnie Gilles' estimate would put that a little higher, even as high as 300 people who had died. In the historiography of these events, instances like this where we don't have records, specific records of these events. Some authors have made various kinds of calculations and come up with all kinds of figures for these things. And one thing here in this particular instance with the Camp d'Espérance, there was a lot of exaggeration in some of the publications, but Ronnie's figures are very well substantiated by the original material. The terrible winter of 1756-57 was followed by another terrible winter in 1757 and 1758, but the great disaster in this instance happened not at the hands of the British, not in British territory, but in the city of Quebec, where many Acadian refugees had gathered. In Quebec, it was a real fortified city, and it had the resources of a city. It had hospitals. It had religious orders. There were nuns who were religious who worked in hospitals. There you could have what would have amounted at the time the best care. But again, the Acadians had no resistance to the smallpox, and a smallpox epidemic broke out in the late fall, so that from November 1757 to about March 1758, there were about 315 Acadians who died. The nuns were beside themselves. They weren't used to that. People in Quebec got smallpox, and people died, yes, but not in those kinds of numbers. The documents of the time cry over this. Then in 1758, the 1st of July, we have another sort of thing that happens. We have the frictions of the remaining Acadians who are desperate in Acadia with the British, as I was mentioning to the lady over here about the resistance, the so-called resistance of the Acadians. There were skirmishes, there were battles that developed largely over the efforts of the fathers to try to get more food to feed their families. And one of these was the Battle of Stony Creek that occurred on the 1st of July in 1758. 5 Acadians were killed in this battle, including a Broussard. Then on the 26th of July in 1758, another disaster befell the Acadians in the form of the fall of Louisbourg. Up until July 1758, the French had a very strong presence in the maritime provinces. They had a great fortress which had been planned to be untakeable. But the engineers made certain miscalculations, and the British got very determined to take it, and they did. And with the end of Louisbourg, there was a second deportation. The British deported from Ile Royale, which is where Louisbourg was situated, but that's now called Cape Breton Island, and from Ile Saint-Jean, which is now Prince Edward Island, which was a dependence of the colony of Ile Royale. They deported a total of something like 9,000 inhabitants, 3,000 from Ile Saint-Jean and 6,000 from Ile Royale. And the deportations took place late in the season. Many of the ships were trying to cross the Atlantic in the winter of 1758-59, particularly in December. It was very stormy. The ships were seaworthy. They had just been used to bring troops to the New World. The troops who captured Louisbourg had been brought on these same vessels. But these vessels, when they were in the North Atlantic in the storms of December, could not withstand the heavy seas, and they sprung leaks. And 2 of them sank in the ocean. One was the Violet, which sank on the 12th of December, and another was the Duke William, which sank on the 13th of December. And a third vessel, the Ruby, ran aground in the Azores on the 16th of December in 1758. At least the captain of the Ruby knew he was going to lose the vessel. He ran it aground deliberately in order to save as many people as he could. He only succeeded in saving a little less than a third of the Acadians who were on the vessel. There were 310. 310 is given as the figure of Acadians who were on the Ruby. Out of that number, 97 were in Cherbourg, were eventually transported from Portugal to England and then retransported to Cherbourg in France. 97, we find 97 survivors in Cherbourg in the late winter of 1759. The Duke William had 362 Acadians who perished in the shipwreck. 4 survivors. There were 4 men who survived from that shipwreck. And the Violet lost all of its passengers. We have no specific figure for the Violet as to how many Acadians she carried. There are documents that give different figures, but they're much too high for her tonnage. There have been studies made of the deportation from Ile Saint-Jean, and it is demonstrated that the vessels carried 9 people for every 10 tons burden, and which corresponds exactly to what was on how many were on the Duke William. The Duke William was 400 tons and had 366 passengers. The Violet would then have, at this rate, would have about 280, 285 passengers. She was lost entirely. The whole crew, captain, everybody was lost on board the Violet. The Duke William did not lose its captain or crew because they got off on a boat, and it lost all but 4 of the Acadians. And the Ruby, as I mentioned, lost about 2/3 with 97 survivors. So that in these 3 shipwrecks, there were over 850 Acadians who lost their lives. This is the single group of events that was the most murderous, that took the most number of Acadian lives in all the period of the deportations. And because of this group of events that took place, and the fact that I used to have nightmares about the children on board of these ships, I proposed some years ago that we commemorate the 13th of December as a memorial day for the loss of lives in the Grand Arrangement. And we've been commemorating this Jour de Souvenir, or Memorial Day, Acadian Memorial Day in New Brunswick for a number of years now. It's also commemorated on Prince Edward Island, and hopefully we'll get the idea passed around into more Acadian areas. The shipwrecks were not the only cause of death among the Acadians who were deported. Many people caught diseases on board the ships. Plus, there was one sickness that beset particularly the children. They were simply seasick. And when it took 2 months to cross the ocean, and you went 2 months without being able to hold any food, you died if you were a child. And children died in great numbers. And in certain ships, there were the extent of the illness was remarkable. It was very terrible. There was a ship called the Mary, which had 560 passengers. 250 to 360 died at sea from the Mary because of illness. This is reported in the British records. There was a second ship that had a very similar name to the Duke William that had the shipwreck. It was called the Duke Guillaume, which is the French translation of Duke William, but it's a different ship. It was loaded with 158 passengers, some from Ile Royale, some from Ile Saint-Jean. Of those, 85 died at sea, 20 more died shortly after arrival, leaving 53 survivors out of 158 people. There were similar loss of life among the families who were deported from Ile Royale itself. There was a vessel called the Richmond that had great mortality aboard. To give you an idea what all the result of this is, of the 3,000 people deported from Ile Saint-Jean, by the summer of 1759, 1,900 people had died. So that's almost 2/3. That's somewhere around 2/3 of all the people who had been loaded on the ships from Ile Saint-Jean. They were all dead by the summer of 1759. If the British had contracted with someone to transport cattle, and they lost 2/3 of the cattle, I guarantee you that they would not have paid for those ships and that transport. And we can compare these terrible events to the transportation of the 7 ships in 1785, which brought 1,600 people to Louisiana. And aboard those 7 ships, there were 4 or 5 people, I don't have the exact number, but about 1/3 of 1% of all the Acadians died on those vessels. People die every day. You get to a certain age, you die. That's the way it works. And if you've got 1,000 people, you've got a certain possibility or probability that someone will lose his life within a certain length of time. So it's not unusual that a few people died out of the 1,600 on 7 ships, but that's 1/3 of 1%. Out of the people deported from Ile Saint-Jean, 2/3 of 100% died. That's a lot different. And in studying these lists, I'd like to point out that I found in trying to do certain reconstructions and to check the validity of my reconstructions, I created what they call pyramids of age, so that I analyzed the passenger lists according to the ages of all the people on board the vessels. And it became apparent to me from this that the median age of the Acadians at the time of these expulsions was about 15 years of age. So half of the population were children, and were people who would have appeared as children at the time, because 15 years and younger, you're not all. I know there's a lot of 14-year-olds who think they're grown up, but I think in this group I can say that we know better. But that was the whole thing, is that in these expulsions, especially the long periods of time they spent at sea, those who died were mostly children, because they couldn't sustain the rigors of the transportation. They couldn't stay seasick for long enough to be able to survive. And we find in the lists, the records the French kept. The French made records, lists of all kinds, because these people were refugees and they had to be looked after. Christian charity dictated that. And the government of France rose to the challenge, but they had to draw up lists and find out who they were. And they drew up lists that not only named all the people who survived to land on French shore, but they also list all the people who died in the process for many of the vessels. And in the case of the 5 packet boats, for example, who disembarked their passengers from Ile Saint-Jean on the 23rd of January in 1759, out of 356 children aged 9 and under, only 70 were still alive by the summer of 1759. So you see that mostly it was the children who paid the price of these terrible events. Out of the 4-year-olds on that vessel, only 4 were still alive in the summer of 1759 out of 52. So 48 had died, 4 survived. Interestingly, one of the 4 of these little children who were survived was named Olivier Thériault. And that name may be familiar to some of you, because Olivier Thériault was this shoemaker who organized the recruitment of Acadians for the 7 ships in 1785. It's the same Olivier Thériault. The stories continue. The most infamous of all British actions, in my estimation, occurred on the 2nd of March in 1759. That's the date of Hazen's raid, when Moses Hazen, one of the British officers, went up the St. John River, and he came right back down a little while later and proudly displayed the 6 scalps that he took from Acadians. This event was supposed to show, of course, the military prowess of the British. But when it was made known that the 6 people who had been scalped were 2 young women, Anastasie Bellefontaine and Marguerite Guibault, who were sisters-in-law, and that the other 4 were 4 of their small children. Even other British officers, such as John Knox, whose journal still exists, he was an officer who was posted in Nova Scotia at the time, deplored this action. What's even worse is the fact that in the 1930s, a well-meaning archaeologist came along and disinterred the bones of these people, and the bones of Anastasie Bellefontaine and Marguerite Guibault are still in Ontario somewhere in a museum, and there have been efforts made for some years now to try to get them returned to New Brunswick, where they can be returned to the ground, to their graves. On the 18th of September in 1759, there followed the surrender of the city of Quebec after the Battle of the Plains of Abraham. And that was really the beginning of the end of the war that had been going on between the British and the French. But it was not the end of the trials and tribulations of the Acadians. In the spring of 1760, there was another smallpox epidemic. This time it was at Charleston in South Carolina. There were 340 Acadians there in March. But according to the New York Mercury newspaper of 14 April 1760, as of the 18th of March, 115 had died. So that their total number was reduced to a little over 200. This resulted in there being many deaths where one husband here and one wife died here, and later on the widower over here and the widow over here got married. And when I was first doing research reconstructing these families, every once in a while I had to have a little more tonic. Excuse me. Yeah, when I was originally reconstructing these families, I noticed there's a listing, of course, in 1763 of the Acadians who wanted to go back to French territory, and there's one for South Carolina, and it gives us all the names of all the people of South Carolina, which is very nice because not all the lists do that. And in this particular colony, we see that if you compare the names of the husbands and wives to the previous or the earlier lists and the earlier documentation we have, nobody seems to match. Because this guy was married to somebody else before, and now he's married to this woman, and what makes it kind of obvious is that you have the blended families, so the children don't all have the same family names. Because some are his and some are hers, and then some are theirs. So it gets to be a little complicated from a genealogical standpoint, but this is the result largely of that smallpox epidemic in 1760. In 1760 also occurred the Battle of Restigouche, where we have the battle in the Bay of Chaleur, which is between present New Brunswick and the Gaspé Peninsula in Quebec. That took place between June 27 and July 8, and it eventually resulted in the surrender of the French forces in Chaleur Bay on the 30th of October in 1760, which had followed by about 7 weeks the surrender on the 8th of September in 1760 of the Marquis de Vaudreuil, the Governor General of New France, in Montreal. And with the surrender of Montreal, for all practical purposes, the war in North America was done. And with the surrender in Chaleur Bay, it was formally all done, because that was the last of the military conflict and the last of the French forces to surrender. Ironically, by the 30th of October in 1760, King George II, who had presided over all these things, had been dead only 5 days. He had died on the 25th of October, and 6 days before he died, Charles Lawrence had died in Nova Scotia. Now, many people think that during these troubled times, the Acadians found a lot of help from the Indians, but there are certain documents which give the lie to that myth, and one of them is a formal complaint that was lodged by Chief Joseph Glaude, who complained that he liked having Acadian guests, basically, but that after so many days and they had eaten them out of house and home, they were getting kind of tiresome. He actually complained that the Acadian refugees were consuming too many of the resources in his area, and he was having a hard time feeding his Indian band. And the other thing is that the Indians and the Acadians throughout this period were largely dependent upon the French, not just in a military sense, and really the military sense was secondary. It was the French were also bringing food supplies from the old country into North America to feed those people who were around their posts. And they were making gifts of food to the Indians and gifts of food to the Acadians for their survival. And then in October of 1761, on the 17th of October, Roderick Mackenzie, Captain Roderick Mackenzie, and his forces left Baie Verte and went north to make a raid against the remaining Acadians who were still at large in the Chaleur Bay region. He rounded up, according to his reports, a group of 187 and then 63 more, making a total of 250 as prisoners. These Acadians were accused of having harassed British shipping and done other sorts of depredations. Many of them had vessels, sailing vessels. They were all confiscated. He had left behind another 430 some odd people. He was back safely in his fort at Fort Cumberland, which had formerly been Fort Beauséjour, by the 3rd of November. And then in August of 1762, another trial took place, another trial of the Acadians in the sense of tribulation in the deportation, the form of the deportation of Acadians to Massachusetts. The French had dared to bring forces to Newfoundland and to attack the British colonies, the British colony in Newfoundland, and that scared the dickens out of the British in Nova Scotia, and they thought that they were vulnerable because they had all these Acadians still in Nova Scotia. They rounded up all those around the area of Halifax, and they brought 130 single men down from, men without their families again, down from the Annapolis region and some other parts, and they packed them up on boats and sent them all to Boston, Massachusetts. And the Boston newspaper on 26th of August 1762 reports that above 700 had just arrived on 9 ships. Some estimates put the number here a bit higher, but we have at least this figure from the newspaper. These were the Acadians who were not allowed to disembark from the ships of deportation, but they were only kept for a couple of weeks and then they were sent back. People in Massachusetts figured they already had their share and they didn't want to have any more Acadian refugees or Acadian prisoners on their hands. Finally, on the 10th of February in 1763, the Treaty of Paris was concluded and the war was over. But that was still not the end. Not the end of this tragic series of events that make up this story. Although the Acadians thought that they were on the road to better things, in June and August, lists were drawn up of those who were in the British colonies who wanted to go to French territory. It looked like things were looking up. And then on the 22nd of December, 1763, the Georgia Gazette reported that 21 Acadians had just departed. They sailed the day before, the 21st of December, on their way to Mobile in Alabama, and that it was their intention from Mobile to get transportation to New Orleans. And these were the first Acadian refugees who arrived here in Louisiana. They arrived in February 1764. However, New Orleans was no longer a French city. It was a French city, but it was no longer under the French flag because the Treaty of Paris had passed Louisiana to the Spanish crown. So no longer was it His Most Christian Majesty, but rather His Most Catholic Majesty. Meanwhile, the nearest French territory that these people could reach, that was still really French, were the islands in the West Indies. So many people, many Acadians in the colonies of New York, Connecticut, Georgia, and South Carolina responded to the offers of the French because the French offered to pay for their transportation and offered to pay for them to be set up as colonists in the islands. And many, many went. However, they were not prepared to withstand the terrible deportations that were going to occur because of the fevers in these colonies. According to the Georgia Gazette on the 24th of April in 1765, a report copied from the Boston Evening Post of the 25th February, out of 700 Acadians who had gone to Mole Saint-Nicolas and Saint-Domingue, 400 had died. Another report puts the number at 420. And there was also a very high mortality among those who went to French Guiana from France. Except for here in Louisiana, apparently, hot climates did not agree with the Acadians. As you know, in the ensuing years, 1765 to 1769, another 1,300 Acadians, or thereabouts, came here to Louisiana. And then in 1785, 1,600 more, and then a few more from time to time. And now here you have the Cajun population of Acadiana that has developed from that. And from the mid-1760s, things did get much better for the Acadian people. I thank you for your kind attention. Yes, ma'am.
How did the French Acadians get to Nova Scotia in the first place? What was the reason they were there in the beginning?
How did the French Acadians get to Nova Scotia in the first place? Well, we know how they got there. They came by boat. We know very little about the motivations of individuals. In the case of Guillaume Trahan, for example, though, we know he was in a lot of trouble in Bourgogne, where he lived in France. Mademoiselle Geneviève Massignon did research a long, long time ago that showed that. So if you see Ray Trahan, don't mention it. He's still sensitive about that. His ancestor had to get out of town, so he came to Acadia. Now, many other people, I'm sure, had similar motivations, that it was more comfortable for them to continue their lives in a new colony rather than stay in the old colony. And that has to really mean that they were in pretty big trouble, because to start off a new life in a wilderness, you made certain sacrifices. You wouldn't be able to go to the movie theaters and so forth anymore. You had to go to this new colony. There was nothing there. But in France at the time, for the peasantry in general, the peasantry didn't have much to lose. So if you went to a new colony and you had the possibility of perhaps making some money on the side, or having a little less authority looking over your shoulder, there may have been benefits perceived by certain people. It's also thought that people were recruited in the sense that the landlords they had in France gave them inducements to come to Acadia to live on another seigneurie, a new seigneurie, where they would still be the landlords, but they would give them certain benefits.
Now, were the men and the women basically, were they treated at times after the deportation? Were they treated like slaves? Were the women and young girls raped? Were they?
Well, actually, to speak to that, we have some records that show that, for example, at the time of the expulsion of the Acadians, there were certain misbehaviors by certain soldiers. But I think that about the worst that is really proved or significantly demonstrated by any of the records is that the soldiers robbed some of the Acadians of their possessions. There are no, I don't think there are any specific reports. Certainly Colonel Winslow in his journal doesn't report any rapes. We do know that there's been an allegation that was made long ago and hasn't been substantiated. It might be substantiated through DNA testing, that a British officer named Edward Howe raped a Préjean in the Chignecto area. Supposedly her son, Jean Doucet, was really Howe's son, but we don't, that's an allegation that was made it's by Edouard Richard in his History of Acadia, but I don't know that it's substantiated. Inevitably in human relations, bad things do happen, but we have, I would say that we have very little evidence of anything of that nature, and if there had been a significant number of incidents, there would be at least some indications in the records.
What about slavery?
Well, now that's a whole other issue in the sense, and in the sense of that, the Acadians who were received in the 9 British colonies where they were deported were placed in, of course, very difficult circumstances, but now the people who were also in these colonies, the British there, they were in difficult circumstances also, in the sense they had to try to find out how to take care of these people or deal with them in one way or another. And because the Acadians had been deprived of all their goods, they arrived essentially destitute. As such, they were considered in many places as poor, as the poor. And in Massachusetts, for example, there were provisions to deal with poor people. There were what they used to call auctions of the poor each year, which was a kind of a process to invite bids from people who would look after poor people, take care of them, and they would receive a certain compensation from the town where they lived. So that did occur with Acadians, and in those instances where there were poor who had to be looked after that way, those who were able-bodied were expected to work. And children were in many instances bound out as apprentices, with the notion that that would lead to them having being gainfully employed eventually and being able to support themselves. And there are reports that in a number of instances those things occurred. We know of a Tando family, for example, who had lived in Beaubassin, where they went to the West Indies, but they left one of their sons behind because he was indentured as an apprentice. And they couldn't take him with them without breaking the contract. And there are various reports about that. Don?
Yes, could you talk a little bit about the Acadians who were held in Halifax towards the end of deportation? Were they in prisons? Were they in prison camps? Were they in work crews?
In all the places where the Acadians, the questions about the Acadians in Halifax and how they were treated at the end, and if they were in prisons or if they were in work details and so on, I think the evidence there is that they were mostly the men were mostly in work details. The whole thing was that, by and large, from what the records substantiate, except for certain obstreperous individuals like Joseph Broussard de Beausoleil, most Acadians, after they had surrendered, after the French surrendered in Montreal, there was no point to trying to make any more conflict with the British. So the choice was either starve in the woods or surrender, and so they surrendered for the sake of having their children nourished. And when they understood that when they surrendered, they had to do what they were told to do. And the British were very interested in having these people as useful to them as possible. And they had problems because they needed roads built, and they employed Acadians doing road work. Of course, many Acadians may have thought they weren't well paid, but you can go down the road, probably down in Sabine Parish, and find lots of people working on roads don't think they're getting paid enough. But then they also were employed, and this was very important to the British, in repairing dikes. All the fertile land that the Acadians had developed was diked land, and the British didn't have a clue as to how the dikes were built. And they had all these colonists they brought in from the so-called planters from Connecticut and so on, and those people didn't have any more clue about the dikes than anybody else. And in 1759, there were terrible storms that broke the dikes, and they were desperate to get these dikes fixed. So they employed Acadians to fix their own dikes. But they were employed, and the evidence is that these people were compensated for their work. They were paid for their work, which is how, when they were released, they had money to buy or build, or either buy the ships or buy the materials to build the ships so that they could leave. There's no evidence or no report that Broussard de Beausoleil or La Chaussée or Bergeron, the men who led the groups of Acadians who came down here, Louisiana, from Halifax in 1764, 65, that any of them had stolen the ship. Whatever arrangements they made, they paid their way. And they paid their way with money they had earned by more or less forced labor, if you like. But
they weren't necessarily guarded, British soldiers guarding these work groups, an honor system, or they had no place to go.
Well, the families were there, and this is the key to an awful lot. The presence of the men's families. If you were you're taken out on a work detail, and your wife and your children are back by the fort, and the British soldiers are in the fort and so forth, and the campground, or whatever you'd like to call it, where the Acadians lived, if they had cabins or shacks or tents or whatever, they were usually made to live near the forts. The families were there. The men were out on detail. A man out on detail who's got his wife and children under the thumb of a bunch of British soldiers isn't going to mess up very much. He's not going to take a chance. He wants to go back and have his wife and children. It's just like the whole thing on Ile Saint-Jean, when they deported the people in Ile Saint-Jean. A lot of people in Ile Saint-Jean had boats when the deportation from there occurred in 1758. And a lot of people have asked me, why didn't these people just take off? Well, yeah, the British came along, the men were out on the boats. They could have gotten away, no question. They could have gotten away and not been deported. But they only could do that at the price of leaving behind their wives, children, mothers, and maiden aunts. And they weren't about to do that. That was the worst thing. I keep getting this recurring message from from the records, which, whether you want to believe it or not, does come in some way from the ancestors. And the one thing that they had always in front of them is, we have to do everything we need to do for the children. That's the one common thread. If you look at the behavior of these people, their resistance to the British, their lack of resistance to the British, everything's calculated to preserve the kids, to keep the kids safe. And one very eloquent document that speaks to that is that at the end of very near the end of her life, Jeanne Dugas, who had been married to Pierre Bois and had a number of children and so forth, she ended up in Cheticamp in Cape Breton. And in 1812, she met the Bishop of Quebec. He came to make a missionary visit, a pastoral visit, I should say. It's a pastoral visit. He came to confirm people and so forth and check up on the priests, see if they were keeping good records and all that sort of thing. And he met Jeanne Dugas. And Jeanne Dugas told him the story of her life, how she had been, she hadn't been deported, but she and her husband was a caboteur, a coaster. He had a sailing vessel. And they moved from place to place. They were always a couple of steps ahead of the British, and they were never caught. Well, I shouldn't say that. They did surrender eventually. They were in Halifax among those who had surrendered. But she told the bishop, we moved here, we moved there. She told all about all her travels, and she said, and I never put my children to bed without their suppers. Now that is an eloquent testimonial that woman's main goal, of which she was entirely and justifiably proud, was that she had taken care of her children. And that was a fine lady. Yes, ma'am.
Were the families housed in the prison island in Halifax?
There were people on George's Island in Halifax Harbor. We know there were Acadians who were incarcerated there prior to being deported. The evidence is that, well, first off, George's Island is not very big, and it's from the physical evidence, it never had much in the way of facilities for housing, it's apparent that people would have been kept there if they were considered unduly dangerous. Or if it was only for a brief time. We do know some documentation has recently come to light, which relates to certain families about which we hadn't known too much about what happened at a certain juncture, and that is it actually reflects on some of the families of the most dangerous men. For Pierre Cyr, for example. One of the men who came back with Broussard, Alexandre Broussard, Jean-Baptiste Savoie, who was married to Marie Haché. Their families, well, I need to explain first that after Father Laguerne saw the error of his ways in telling the women not to turn themselves in, what had happened was that the British, when they saw the women weren't coming in, they really wanted those women and children to come in to be deported with their husbands and fathers, and they went out and around and they burned all the farms, so that the women would have no resources. The idea that they would have no recourse but to turn themselves in. Laguerne, meanwhile, this is a very terrible chess game when you look at it, but he upped the ante again, and then he arranged to have those women and their children brought over to the coast and then transported over to Ile Saint-Jean. There were 100 women, that's what the figure he gives, it's around 100 at least, and altogether about 500 people with all the children and old folks and what have you, a few old men particularly, and they went across to Ile Saint-Jean, and then there were too many people on Ile Saint-Jean for the local resources, and the commandant, Gabriel de Rousseau de Villejoin, made arrangements to have people sent up to Quebec. But on the way up to Quebec, one of the vessels was captured. And it was the vessel that Anne Poirier, who was the wife of Pierre Cyr and her kids, and Marie Haché, who was married to Jean-Baptiste Savoie, and her kids, they were all captured. And they were brought as a prize, or prisoners, down to Nova Scotia, and they were in Halifax. And René Gilles Leblanc, whom I've mentioned a couple of times, found a document which shows that they were made to camp outdoors. There was no place to put them, and they camped outdoors for some time. It was in pretty good weather, but then it started to get cold, so they decided they would make an exchange of prisoners, and they were going to send them around to, well, they sent them to Ile Royale, and then they were going to get passage from there up to Quebec. And something went wrong, and there was a problem with the ship, and they had to be landed at what was then called Baie des Espagnols, but it's now Sydney. And we know that these two families particularly were in this group because a couple of the girls married fellows from Louisbourg just a little bit later in the time frame when these families would have been there, because they did eventually go to the city of Quebec, except for the girls who stayed behind with their new husbands. Yes, sir.
Could you speak on any Acadians that went to Maryland?
Any Acadians who went to Maryland? Well, there were a lot of Acadians who went to Maryland, and actually we have the expert on the Acadians in Maryland, the second row here in the form of Greg Wood. What do you want to say, Greg?
If people would like to talk about it after your talk, we won't steal any of your time, but it's very interesting story, certainly a great impact on Louisiana in the 1760s.
So there you are. Greg Wood will be available to talk to you at any time after. I could talk now, but you'd get much better information from Greg Wood. Yes?
Could you speak to, you often hear Le Lut, and it seems like the priests in some way sort of made it worse for the Acadians than better, but they thought they were doing something that was good for the Acadians.
Well, that's the situation with Father Leguerne. He was a young man, a young priest, didn't have a lot of experience, and he told the women. He himself reports this. This is from him. He confesses this. He told the women not to turn themselves in, and there was a terrible price to pay for that because the men were sent away and they were separated from their families. And because of what happened subsequently, it was even more terrible. The 100 women who went over to Ile Saint-Jean, most of them went to Quebec, and most of them were there during the smallpox epidemic, and a lot of them died. And by the time the men, if they survived, finally reached their families, or what was left of their families, there were a lot of the family members who had passed away, who died. They lost their wives and children. So that certainly was a bad piece of advice. Although in Leguerne's case, I don't think that we could say that it was politically motivated. However, most people would agree that Father Le Lut did many things that were more politically motivated. But the political motivation was to try to keep the people French and Catholic, which in those days was more or less synonymous terms in the context. Many things were done, I think, by the priests with the idea that it was to preserve the religion. They certainly didn't want the Acadians to be deported to the English colonies because they feared that they would become assimilated, and to become assimilated they would have to become Protestant. And indeed, in some instances that did occur. And in the whether they were well advised or not, that's a whole other issue. I mean, it's like anything else. You make a judgment based on certain things. Although Le Lut is accused of many things which can't be proved. Oh yes, yes, ma'am.
What was the Canadians' connection with slavery? Say that they came here before, they were deported, a lot of that right here in Louisiana, were some of them well-to-do, and they came here and they
Okay, well, I'm not an expert on Louisiana history, but I know this much. I know that when the Acadians came here, they had very little. But this was a very poorly developed colony. The French did, overall, we have to admit that the French did a relatively poor job in developing colonies in North America. They just didn't spend enough on them and develop them sufficiently. So the colony became Spanish, and the Spanish were very seriously interested in developing the colony, and when they had the chance of getting Acadian colonists, because the Acadians were Catholics, they were very glad to have them. And His Most Catholic Majesty made available to the Acadians easy terms to get land, and provided tools and food and all the means to succeed if you wanted to work real hard. And the Acadians were willing to work real hard, and although they all started out poor, in the space of a generation or 2 generations, many of them had acquired an awful lot of worldly goods, including extensive land, large herds of various kinds of animals, and I regret to say they had also bought human beings as slaves. And they were living in a place where slavery was tolerated, and they practiced the same as their neighbors in that regard. Another question? Yes, sir.
I met a lady in Maryland who was at the 2004 Congress, and she said she did research which indicated some of the 7 ships were the same ships used to transport slaves. Is that correct?
Whether some of the 7 ships had been used as slavers, I don't know offhand. It could be. It could well be. It's entirely, I suppose it's entirely possible, although for certain reasons I would say that it wouldn't have been practical to use the same ships. Slavery existed. Slavery wasn't outlawed until, well, the British stopped outlawed slave trade in, what, 1806, 1807? Wilberforce was very strong. There were campaigns against the slave trade and against slavery for a very long time before it was, all that stuff was abolished. I don't know what the ships were used for before or after the 7 ships. I'm sorry.
I'm going to ask a question that maybe a lot of Cajuns don't want to hear, but I kind of wanted your idea on it. And not that I knew of any of my family owned slaves, but we know that many of the slaves from French Acadian families, the women were raped and had children for these people. Now, don't we consider that their descendants our family? And we should?
Well, I would say we should.
We should. That's what I
I
think.
certainly say we should.
Because
I mean, it's just like Thomas Jefferson had a whole family that was.
They were slaves and they were forced into that, and now we have children. And you know, a lot of the white people, a lot of the descendants of the Cajun want to turn their backs on them, but you can't do that.
Well, whenever you have different populations of different races in proximity, you will have mixture.
Right.
Just as in Acadia we had intermarriage between the French and ultimately Acadians and the native population.
And the Germans and the Italians.
Oh yes, yes, yes.
And everybody else. And they were more accepted because they were not of African heritage, which I think is.
Well, here and in the West Indies, there are records of marriages between people of different race. The expression of free white or free people of color. But I attended 7 reunions in 1999, and not everybody at all the reunions was pure white. No, by no means. Well, if there are no more questions, I'll give a great big sigh of relief.